I want to talk about the Rover, and we're looking at the Rover this week. But I really want to talk about Robert Connolly, and we're going to look at sort of Robert Connolly over. Well, last week we started with Bellabo, where we were talking about Robert Connolly's The White Paper this week, and then next week I want to look at The Turning, which is a film that he produced. He also was part of the direction as well. But really, what happened with Bellabo is he made Bellabo, and he thought that Bellabo was a really good film. He was expecting a big box office for it. He thought it would do really well in education, that schools would really be interested in teaching the film, and some schools sort of did take on the film. But overall, the film really didn't do very well at all, making, I think, about 1 million at the box office, which was a real disappointment for him. And rather than do what a lot of Australian directors do, which is sort of blame the industry for sort of letting them down, he started to rethink the whole idea of Australian films and its kind of disengagement with Australian audiences and what's actually going on and why Australians aren't going to see Australian films as much as, say, American films. And he came up with really what's the white paper, what he kind of termed the white paper. And his central argument, there's kind of two arguments that he was making. One that we'll be looking at next week, which is the whole idea of the event cinema screening. So he's saying rather than just distribute your film far and wide, actually have event screenings. So have fewer screenings, but just have them more as an event. So we'll be looking at next week. But another problem that he was having was the inflated budgets of Australian films. And he just felt the budgets were just too over the top. And I think The Rover becomes a really fascinating example. So I want to look at Robert Connolly's white paper, and I just sort of want to apply a lot of the points he's making about these inflated budgets to The Rover. I just want to preface this by saying it's not like I don't like The Rover. I think The Rover is a really interesting film. I think it looks incredible, like it looks amazing. And there are two really wonderful performances here in Guy Pearce, the always great Guy Pearce, and Robert Pattinson, who is also very, very interesting in what he's actually trying to do. Scoot Maneri is also in it. He is an actor that you may have seen in the Andrew Dominik film, Killing Them Softly. So there are a really interesting choice of casts in some American actors and also some Australian actors. It is a co-production between an Australian and a US indie company. So that's something else that we could also talk about in the classrooms. The Rover as adaptation, and really how the film is kind of establishing itself as this sort of Australian, non-Australian. It's sort of a futuristic film. So, we can discuss that also. So the Rover, I just want to talk really about the Rover and its budget. Now, the budget was 12 million, which I don't know if you would consider that a big budget or a small budget. I guess when we often we're thinking or discussing budgets, we're talking about Hollywood standard budgets, the 100 millions, the 200 million sort of budget, and 12 million may seem like a pretty small budget to you, but it's actually quite a big budget if you actually think about it. Now, on the right hand side, what I've got here is a list of sort of the all-time Australian films, right? Grossing Australian films. So you've got Baz Luhrmann's Australia, which makes 37 million. Ned Kelly, which is the 2003, Ned Kelly makes 8 million. Road Proof Fence makes 7 million. Kath and Kim Dorella, which, you'd be surprised to know, made 6 million at the Australian box office. So I was a little sort of taken aback by that. And Chopper making 5 million. Now the point here I'm trying to make is the budget's 12 million. All right. So for the budget to actually get for the budget to get back all of its costs, it has to make about 30 million. So it has to make sort of 2.5 times the budget, right, to make back its costs. So what the Rover needs to do is make about 30 million at the Australian box office to break 30 million sort of at the international box office, more than just the Australian box office, to break even. Now the question is the Rover actually going to do that? Now if you look at these all-time figures, what the Rover needs to do is basically the kind of business that Baz Luhrmann's Australia is doing. And I don't know if you remember Australia when it came out, but the campaign was just huge. Like, it was massive, and there was just a real excitement about Australia. And Australia is an extremely mainstream film, right? Extremely commercial mainstream film, as are all of Baz Luhrmann's films. Now, the Rover The Rover is a more kind of independent, sort of meditative sort of film, right? And that's what I really like about the film. But you've sort of got to ask, was the film actually going to do that kind of business? And if the film wasn't going to do that kind of business, then why have a budget as at 12 million? Now, if you actually look at the box office, so it makes $1 million in Australia, and it makes $1 million, almost 2 million, just under 2 million internationally, right? So overall, it makes 2 million back from its 12 million budget. So the film was a huge loss, like a massive, massive loss. And the whole question is that really sustainable? All right, so David Michôd is a really good director. He makes Animal Kingdom, which is a fascinating film. And if you're actually thinking about establishing careers internationally, Jackie Weaver, Ben Mendelsohn, Joel Edgerton have all been able to create really ongoing careers in Hollywood on the back of Animal Kingdom, and Animal Kingdom being a hugely successful film in Australia and a hugely critically acclaimed film in America. And a lot of those actors were actually able to go on and do some really interesting things in Hollywood, as well as coming back. Jackie Weaver has sort of been the one who's really been coming back and forth, as has Joel Edgerton. Ben Mendelsohn, we seem to have lost to Hollywood. He seems to be there doing a lot of really interesting things. But yeah, the real question is, with a film like Rover, do you really need a budget of 12 million? And you can sort of argue, well, the budget went into the cast, but I'll talk about the cast, and often, the star casting doesn't always guarantee a big box office. So the problem of the Rover is the problem of audience, or the lack of, right? And we're really talking about the Rover and box office here today, and sort of trying to get a sense of a successful film and what actually makes a successful film, both nationally and internationally. So when it comes to Australian films, audiences don't entirely matter. And that's actually kind of truthful if you start to sort of break down how the industry is operated. Now, the industry produces very little incentive for successful box office, right? Because what producers do, right, is they glean their income from within the budget, not the box office success. So what happens is, if you have a big budget, right, everybody kind of gets a percentage from the budget, right? So if you've got, say, a $10 million film, you might get 3% of the budget. So 10 million or 30 million, you kind of want to push the budget up as much as you can, because the bigger the budget, the bigger your the bigger your take-home wage. It really has nothing to do with box office success. And Robert Connolly's white paper, and please do read it. I mean, it's a really interesting read. It's not a heavy read at all. It's sort of questioning this whole thing. It's actually saying, well, maybe we should, maybe there is something in the American model where a lot of the take-home money for producers and cast is actually through the box office, and it's in their best interest to make successful films. And what's really important to American films is they're tapping directly into audiences and connecting directly to audiences, and big audiences. And he's sort of arguing that maybe there is a real problem here for Australian films, that they're not doing that. And if you actually look at the really successful Australian films like a Kenny, even The Water Diviner, these are films that are doing something with audiences. They know their audiences, and they're creating a film directly for a particular demographic. And there's something to be said about those films. And the question, I guess, is, does the Rover actually do that? So the payment system of the industry is the fees are based on a percentage of the film's budget, like I said. So this is kind of how it works. So directors generally get about 3% of the budget, right? So if the budget's 5 million, right, the director gets 150,000, right? If the budget's 500,000, the director gets 15,000. So that's their take-home wage, right? So it's in the best interest for a director to want to work on at least the $5 million films, because they don't want to work for next to nothing, because $15,000 on a film for a director is nothing. That's thinking a year of your life at least is put into a feature film. And so a year of your life, $15,000, not really worth it. A year of your life for $150,000, yeah, you can probably sort of justify that argument. So it's really interesting what's going on with the industry, and just basically how it's set up through a percentage of the budget. And Robert Connolly is actually saying there's no incentive for directors to work with smaller budgets. And that's the real problem. So what happens is you work with a bigger budget, the film doesn't do well. So like the Rover. And then it's really hard for that director to get their next film up. And I think the real problem, often when we talk about Australian films, and this is what Robert Connolly is talking about with in his white paper, is often we talk about single films and single directors. So say, Adam Elliott making Mary and Max, or, Clayton Jacobson making Kenny. And he's not talking about a director's sort of whole body of work and actually working in sort of creating a sustainable filmography for themselves. And that's a real problem. So, 80% of first-time directors in Australia never make another feature. So that's a huge, huge problem for the industry. It's not a successful industry as far as directors being able to establish themselves. And there is a real disconnect here between audiences and the films that are being made. And what Robert Connolly is really asking is, are these films actually being made with an audience in mind? Now, the industry is based on perverse incentives. These are factors that reward individuals for taking actions that produce negative consequences. So these are all mapped out in his white paper. Fees based on percentage of the budget, forcing producers to increase the budget. Right? Not mandatory income reward profits for successful films. Government investments that are sometimes conditional on the attachment of marquee cast. This puts pressure on the cost line. So basically, you cast Robert Pattinson in the Rover, and the budget just goes up. Goes up quite a lot, and you might get some incentives from the government for having Robert Pattinson in your Australian film. But the problem is now you're dealing with a budget that you can't actually manage, and that actually won't bring back a profit, and that becomes a real problem. Also, government investments are driven by the percentage of the budget, encouraging the producer to inflate the budget. Right, so it's all about inflate the budget, right? To actually get the government incentives and really, to please everybody working in the production, because they all have a bigger take-home package. But it's a real problem. It's a real problem for the sustainable industry. And, that's essentially what all Australians want from their industry, for the national industry, is a self-sustainable industry, an industry that is actually successful. And more so, an industry that actually taps into audiences and what they want. It's interesting, in the UK a couple of years ago, they did a poll. They did a national poll. It was an online poll, and they asked every British film watcher and film goer to actually nominate the sorts of films that they want to see funded. And what happened is all the funding system in Britain changed because of that. And what came through it was they wanted more young people films, and they wanted more old people films. So they wanted all those sort of older comedy, there's kind of the geriatric comedies, I think they're calling them. And that seemed to change everything in Britain. And now Britain have a very, very successful industry. The films are doing really well. And based on the success means that they can actually put money into also other sort of smaller independent films. So if you actually look at Britain as an example, and all they did was they asked the audience. They went out and they said, you tell us the sort of films that you want rather than us. So basically, the films that were being made were the films that the audiences wanted, and the audiences were actually keen to see those sorts of films. And it did significantly change the box office. So what Connolly says in the white paper is the industry should eliminate perverse incentives by discouraging percentage-based remuneration, because it doesn't encourage producers to work with smaller budgets. And that's what he's all about, Connolly is, right? He's all about working with smaller budgets. And if you actually look at Balabai, Balabai's 4 million compared to the Rover 12 million. And, I sort of put it to you, you tell me how the Rover is, where's the extra sort of 8 million going in the Rover? I guess it's going in Robert Pattinson's pocket more than anything. And you sort of may make the argument, Robert Pattinson probably worked for nothing on the film. Well, it doesn't actually work like that. There's this great story about Fight Club, the David Fincher Fight Club, and he went to Brad Pitt when he was casting the film. And Brad Pitt's fee, I think, was about 30 million. He went to Brad Pitt and he said, look, I've got this great script for you. It's Fight Club. Brad Pitt read the script. He loved the script. And he went back to Fincher. He said, I'll do it for nothing. So Fincher said, fantastic. So Fincher went to Brad Pitt's agent and he said, right, I've got this film, it's called Fight Club, Brad Pitt's going to do it for next to nothing. And Brad Pitt's agent said, no way you're getting Brad Pitt for nothing. Because if I give you Brad Pitt for nothing, every other director in Hollywood wants Brad Pitt for nothing. So you have to get him for his market value, which is $30 million. Now at the time, the budget for the film was $30 million. So that budget had to be inflated up to about $70 million just to get Brad Pitt. So suddenly they're dealing with a major problem. And let's not forget that Fight Club was a box office disaster when it came out because of because of that. So what Robert Connolly is saying is, let's work with smaller budgets and actually cast appropriately. So Connolly is arguing for positive incentives. So filmmakers' contribution should be based on a flat fee, regardless of the budget. So basically, as a director, this is your fee and this is what you work for, regardless of what's actually going on in the budget. So government funding in accordance with a producer's track record. And that's what he's actually saying. He's saying, so if you're going to fund the films, actually look at who are you funding. It's not just all about funding first-time directors. It's actually about funding people who have industry experience, and he thinks that that's a really important thing, and it's something that's actually not happening. And his criticism for, I guess, film production in university is what you're essentially doing is all you're doing is training first-time directors, and that's all you're doing. You're not actually training them to work on other films, to other roles within a film. It's just they are sort of this whole auteur idea, and he actually thinks it's a real problem within the industry. Now, if you've got the government funding in accordance with a producer's track record, it will encourage faster turnaround between budgets, experienced producers to work with smaller budgets, and everybody working to make successful films. And that's what he's really arguing. We need to be thinking always about making a successful film. And he feels that we're not doing that. Now, of course, he doesn't mention the Rover, and of course, when he wrote the white paper, the Rover hadn't even been produced. But I think the Rover is a good example of how we still have problems in the industry of over-budgeted films, and that aren't just returning a successful box office, and it's actually causing greater problems for the directors involved in such films, and also for the industry at large, as who do we actually fund and things like that. So he's actually saying it's a bit of a no-brainer. You just look at the experienced people in the industry and you have them working with smaller budgets, and this actually means that more Australian films are being made, because if we're all working with smaller budgets, we can actually get a quicker turnaround. So a better model is a more effective approach is to take a developed screenplay and the proposed creative team, right? So that's what he's saying you should be budgeted on, right? So you calculate a budget level that could be financed. Now budgets are based on what's required to get the film made. So the Rover costs $12 million, but the question is why? Do you actually need $12 million to get the Rover made? I mean, the Rover is it's a really peculiar film. It's not actually populated by a lot of actors. It's a very, very small thinking kind of film. And it's an interesting film if you actually compare it to something like Mad Max, they're similar settings, similar time, sort of both kind of future films. But Mad Max has a cast of 1 million, it seems, in comparison to the Rover. And, there's no question why the Rover, doesn't do well and why Mad Max does so well. The Rover doesn't have what Mad Max has as far as these unbelievable action sequences. But that's maybe of unfair criticism, because the Rover, in a way, it's a character study. It's a character study of these two men that are sort of being kind of forced together. Now, films should have a realistic budget goal that justifies the final film and the box office potential. So the whole question is, was the Rover ever going to be a box office bonanza? And probably not. So the answer, what Robert Connolly is saying, is we really just have to involve audiences, right? So Hollywood, it depends on good box office, right? You have to have a good box office. Without a good box office, your career will be very, shortly lived. So successful of one film helps support the next. Now, this doesn't apply in Australia. Everyone is already paid once the film comes out. So if payment was based on box office, what Robert Connolly is saying, right, then audiences would matter, because Australian films would be forced to connect with the audiences, because all the people working on the film, right, it would actually depend on their payment for the film to be successful. And he's saying that can only be a positive if we're actually thinking more about the audiences, and we're not thinking about the audiences. And the problem he's saying is So the industry, you can sort of break the industry down into kind of three sections, right? You can say there's production, there's distribution, where the films go and how they're distributed to, other countries and their own country, and exhibition, the playing of the films. And what you have in America is America's kind of based on exhibition, right? So everything is based on where the films will play, how they will play, who they will play to. In Australia, it's about production. It's about directors with their own vision making their own film. And exhibition, how the films play and where they play, kind of becomes a bit of an afterthought. And Robert Connolly is trying to shift that by sort of provoking a different way of thinking about the industry. So the problem with the Rover is most of its problems could have been fixed. And if you actually look at the problem of the film, it's really in the screenplay. There are great performances and it looks amazing, but it's a really bonkers kind of story. The story doesn't actually go anywhere, and the whole question is what's actually going on in the screenplay. The film should be budgeted on the screenplay and the proposed creative team. Who's actually putting this film together. And not stars and story. Great stories and great stars don't automatically make great films. And that's another problem. Like, Robert Pattinson is considered a big star. But it's not like you put Robert Pattinson in any film and the film's going to be a box office bonanza, right? You put Robert Pattinson in Fantastic Four or, Mad Max or, a film like that. The film is probably going to add on its box office. But a film like The Rover, Robert Pattinson, small indie Australian film, it's probably not going to do a lot more business because he's in it. And they shaved his great head of hair in this film, which is kind of surprising. He's sort of got this sort of crew cut hair. And the thing is, they're trying to make him look ugly, and he does look a little bit ugly, or as ugly as Robert Pattinson can actually look, which is again really kind of interesting what they're actually doing with him and how they're kind of trying to strip away his own kind of beautiful looks and his own sort of star persona. So the films need to justify stars and realistically budget for them, right? So marquee Australian stars now expect as much as 10% of the total budget. So, based on Hollywood model of paying. The cast member is rewarded for helping attract finance with a larger fee and rewarded for attracting an audience with a share of the film's profit. So it's again, a percentage of the budget, where what Connolly is saying is maybe we should be getting rid of these percentages of the budget and actually thinking about flat fees and actually giving actors, what their time is worth, but, what they actually contribute to the film. So the question about The Rover is, does the star cast reflect the market value of the film? So the market value of The Rover is this. It's going to be an independent film. It's a follow-up to Animal Kingdom, but it's a much smaller film than Animal Kingdom in many ways. It's not the sort of the true story of Animal Kingdom. It's not going to have that resonance, with Australians in the way that Animal Kingdom does. He made The Rover very quickly, and it's going to be an interesting film. It's going to be a film that will attract some interest, but will it really get those big box office dollars? Probably not. So the question is, do you actually need a Robert Pattinson in it? Now, Guy Pearce is interesting. Guy Pearce does do a lot of Australian films, different sorts of films. He's a name. I don't know if he's the box office draw. I'd be surprised if people are running out to see Guy Pearce. Well, obviously I'm running out to see Guy Pearce because, in my opinion, he's the most interesting actor working in the industry today, both in America and Australia. But are people really running out to see a Guy Pearce film? I don't think so. I think he adds value, but I don't think he is. It'd be hard to market a film around Guy Pearce's stardom. And if you actually look at how he's cast in most films, certainly most American films, he's not the star. He's sort of, he has those bit parts, and he's always great, but, that's Guy Pearce. Okay, so just finally, this is Peter Spierig. So this is from the Spierig brothers, who made Daybreakers and Predestination. So they basically make kind of Hollywood films in Australia. They actually use, so this is the Baz Luhrmann model, yeah? And what he's saying is, this is, basically, when you're thinking about international Australian film, This is what he says. You can't make these 20 million movies without going overseas to get money. The Australian film industry can't sustain that. One of the main reasons the local industry can't sustain such a production is that it doesn't work with the audience in mind. Filmmaking is, by its very nature, commercial, and money spent on production has to at least be attempted to be recouped. You should feel the responsibility to make that money back. You can't make a 20 million movie and expect to recoup that money by targeting just an Australian audience. Now, so there's two models here, right? There's this model, which they're basically saying, yeah, you've got to make the 20 million, you've got to make those big $20 million movies, but what you actually have to do is you have to go outside Australia to get the money to do it, right? So there's that idea. And then there's the Robert Connolly idea, which is saying, let's actually just don't make these $20 million movies, okay? We can actually make really good movies for a much smaller budget that will actually tap into the Australian market. And, you know, what he's encouraging Australian film directors to do is make much smaller budgeted films, right? That it can actually connect with an audience rather than making these big films. Now, the thing about Predestination is it was a $20 million film, but again, it didn't actually connect with its audience. So you've sort of got to ask whether, even if you go outside to get the money, if it's actually working as far as, you know, a film like that actually finding its audience and tapping into the audience. So let's leave it there. I think The Rover is a really intriguing film, a really fascinating film, and it's a really interesting sort of conversation point, The Rover, because it does so many things well as far as performances go, but then it kind of fails for so many other reasons. And I think that's why it's really interesting. It's really interesting as an international Australian film, what it's actually trying to do. It's trying to set up this sort of Australian nowhere place, which again is really interesting. And also the casting is really fascinating. And also it's really interesting through, say, a David Mee show who makes Animal Kingdom, sets up a lot of careers for actors, and he's also trying to set up his own career, you know, internationally. And I suppose the question of The Rover is it the right choice for him to make at that time? Okay, I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoy The Rover.